Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to continue talking about migration. Let's start with a knowledge check. Please report your response to this question on the left side of the screen to get credit for it. Okay, so among these answers, what are the conditions that are most likely to cause evolutionary change by migration? Remember the snakes. It is not if two populations have very similar allele frequencies, right? Because then they already look like each other and you're not going to get much change if they're exchanging genes. And whether they're moving in one direction or two directions matters for one population but not the other, and it's not really the answer. But C, if there's a lot of migration occurring, so if M is large, the migration rate, then yes, that's going to cause more rapid evolution by migration. All right, so on Tuesday, you got the basics of migration, and today we're going to start layering migration with other ideas, so with natural selection and with genetic drift. And then we're going to talk about cost and benefits of migration in terms of conservation. Okay, so we haven't really talked about natural selection in a spatial way yet. So let me introduce some concepts about how landscape and space impacts natural selection. So first, when populations of the same species live in areas with different environmental conditions, natural selection will cause each population to adapt to its unique conditions. And this can cause populations to diverge both genetically and phenotypically. So populations of the same species to diverge genetically and phenotypically. So they could look different, have differences in physiology. This is just the definition of phenotype, right? So differences in physiology, or differences in behaviors. Okay, and all of these sort of differences that are selected for under their unique conditions are called local adaptations. So that's our new vocab word for this slide. And local adaptations occur when selection favors different alleles or phenotypes for many genes with small effects in different places. Okay? And this can lead to large differences between different populations of a single species, between diff pops of the same species. It can also cause a species to speciate and become two different species. That has been known to happen. Okay, so local adaptations, they occur in specific circumstances and they make two different populations different from each other based on the specifics of the environment that they're in. So how does gene flow, right? Because remember, we're layering gene flow on top of natural selection. How does gene flow interact with this? So how does gene flow interact with local adaptations? Well, for one, gene flow and we know this already from the first unit. So gene flow can limit divergence among populations. So it's a force keeping them the same. And gene flow, because of this, gene flow can prevent populations from adapting to local environments. So gene flow and natural selection can be in conflict with each other. Okay, and we're going to look at an example of this now. So here's a story about local adaptation. In a lot of places, the soil around abandoned mines are full of toxic metals, and most plants can't grow in them because of that. They're lethal to plants. But in Wales, there's one species of plant called the common bent grass that has evolved the ability to grow in soil around mines, especially copper mines, which were common out there. So they have a higher copper tolerance than other types of bent grass. All right. Researchers wanted to understand the occurrence of this higher tolerance around mines in this species. And so they set up this experiment. They set up two transects. So here's transect 1 and transect 2. And each transect had 5 sites, which is each of these red dots. Okay. One transect was in the mine, from the middle to the edge of the mine. And one transect was downwind from the mine. So transect 2 is downwind from the mine. So there's one site in the mine and then everything else is outside the mine. And so an important piece of biology to know about bent grass is that the seeds of bent grass are dispersed by wind. All right, so what they did is at each of these 10 sites, they measured the copper tolerance of the adult plants growing there, and they collected seeds and measured the copper tolerance of those seeds. All right, so this example is really trying to illustrate the relationship between gene flow and natural selection. And you're going to get a series of multiple choice questions that kind of guide you through this graph and help you draw some conclusions. Good luck. Okay, through those activities, I hope you started to see some patterns that helped you understand gene flow and the balance with natural selection. But we're going to go through and really outline some conclusions from this as well to just kind of wrap it up. So first of all, let's talk about what we can see from these graphs about local adaptation. So on the mine, adults are more tolerant of copper than the plants grown from seeds. So the red lines, which are the adults, are higher than the blue lines consistently, except for the one site outside the mine, where they're the same height. So this suggests there is natural selection for copper tolerance. And here's how that site works. Among plants that germinate, on the mine, and germinate means to produce seeds. Only the few among the plants that germinate, i.e. grow from seeds, not produce seeds, on the mine, only the few that can tolerate high levels of copper survive and reproduce. Okay, so that's selection. Selection hasn't happened on the seeds, right, that were collected, but instead, as the seeds try to grow up to adults, that is when the copper tolerance becomes important, and because that's when selection is happening. Now, away from the mine, so on the mine, away from the mine, it's a different story. So in transect 2, the transect over here, we see a different pattern. What we saw there is that plants grown from seeds are more copper tolerant than adults. This doesn't mean natural selection isn't happening. In fact, natural selection is happening. It's just happening in a different way. So natural selection in this environment is against copper tolerance. So when you're not on the mine, there is selection against having that copper tolerance. And again, we can see that. So among plants that germinate, which is growing from seeds, and they're doing this away from the mine, only those oops, dot got too big. Only those that can outcompete others. Cats again. I'm going to have to post pictures of them because they're going to be part of all these presentations. So only those that can outcompete others for resources can survive and reproduce, right? Just the normal definition of fitness here. Each generation. And there seems to be a disadvantage for fitness of copper tolerance. And we see that in the graph because we see lower copper tolerance in adult plants that made it through selection. Than in the seeds, which haven't experienced natural selection yet, right? So again, the blue bars are higher than the red bars. The blue bars are the seeds, the red bars are the adults. The only place the red bar is higher is the one site that's on the mine. So the adults seem to do better if they don't have copper tolerance. So the next question to ask yourself is, why haven't these two populations completely diverged? Why is there still high tolerance for copper in the field, and we're still seeing a lot of seeds with low tolerance for copper on the mine? And of course, you know the answer to that. It's because migration. So if selection was the only force working, then grass at the mine would become fixed for copper tolerance. So copper tolerance alleles. And grass away from the mine would have no tolerance, would be fixed for no tolerance. But this is not what we see. Gene flow prevents this from happening. Okay? Each generation, here's how the gene flow works, right? So each generation, pollen and seeds from non-mine areas blow onto the mine. So we didn't really talk about what was upwind from the mine, but it was just more grass fields. So pollen and seeds from those are blowing onto this mine. And then also gene flow from the mine prevents alleles for tolerance from being completely lost in the pasture nearby or in the field. Right? So we've got gene flow, seeds and pollen from the mine blowing downwind into the field. So there's always going to be individuals that are not adapted to that environment mixing with individuals who are, which is going to prevent fixation for the local adaptation. That in-depth example really illustrates a general conclusion about gene flow and natural selection that probably isn't going to surprise you. Populations exhibit a compromise between gene flow and natural selection that depends on the relative strength of each of them. So you've seen this before. We talked about this with genetic drift and natural selection and how it's the relative strength of the two that matters as to who has more influence evolutionarily in a population. The same thing is happening here. So there is an equation to describe this. So equation, and here's what it's describing. Describing ability of non-adaptive alleles alleles to invade a population. Which is really giving you a sense of the relative strength of migration. Okay. All right, so let's assume for this equation to work, assume that there are P and Q alleles. P and Q alleles. But Q has selective advantage. It's a local adaptation. And it's currently fixed. In the population. All right, so what would it take for the P allele to invade? So the frequency, here's the equation. Frequency of Q allele is approximately equal to 1 minus the migration rate divided by the selection coefficient. So when the selection coefficient is really large, because it's the denominator, right, it's going to drive this number low. And so Q is going to stay close to fixed, right? 1 minus Q. When the migration rate is high and the selection coefficient is small, then that's going to drive 1 down, right? Because the denominator is small and the numerator is large. All right, so in words, we can say when M is much smaller than S, gene flow overwhelms gene flow overwhelmed, and local adaptations persist. Almost got myself turned around there. All right, but when migration is much larger than the selection coefficient, then locally adapted allele will decline in frequency. And depending on how much migration is happening, it could even be lost. And we're going to talk about a potential example of that towards the end of this unit. All right, and this situation is called outbreeding depression. And this is when the definition of this term is gene flow introduces maladaptive individuals into the population and constrains adaptations. In our bent grass example, we saw this not to an extreme degree. Selection was still strong enough, right, to maintain that copper tolerance on the mine, but you were getting every generation seeds and sperm coming in that were maladaptive, right? They didn't have the copper tolerance. And so there were always individuals who were coming in that were maladaptive, right? So that's an example of that. We can also talk about the balance of gene flow and genetic drift. So genetic drift, like selection, genetic drift can cause populations to diverge. Okay, but its potential to do so is limited by gene flow and migration. All right, so we have this little scenario. It's not much of a scenario, but it's what we got. So we've got two populations that have migration occurring between them. When that happens, so that's all it takes. There's a mathematical model that predicts the outcomes. that we can use. So here, I'm not going to go through the model, but I'm going to tell you the predictions. So the first one is, if the average number of individuals arriving each generation is less than 1, then the 2 pops will be very different from one another. And this, of course, is in terms of phenotype, so phenotypically and genetically. Possibly a little more genetically because we're talking about drift. But how do you get less than 1 individual generation? Because, right, you're a whole unit, you're 1 individual. If you're moving, it just means that you don't have migration happening every generation, right? And the less and less migration you have, then genetic drift can cause populations to diverge, and the gene flow is not there to prevent it, okay? But all it takes, the point of this, is 1 individual a generation. So if the average number of individuals arriving at each population is greater than 1 per gen, the 2 populations will not diverge. So the conclusion here that I want you to take home is that it doesn't take much more migration to hold populations together. So one individual a generation is enough. So 1 individual generation, let me tell you what it's doing, migrating, so you have it in your notes, between pops. Is enough to overcome drift in most situations and keep the populations looking similar. All right. 1 individual per generation is all you need to counter drift.